Order. Welcome to the public accounts today on Thursday the 21st of November for our session on local roads in England. Today we have as our witnesses from my left Dave Buttery, then of course in the centre the Permanent Secretary Dame Bernadette, very warm welcome to her, and Robert Furness on my right. So Dave Buttery is the Director of Road Strategy. Robert Furness is the Deputy Director of Local Highways and Active Travel. So a special warm welcome to Dave and Rupert because this is your first appearance. So it will be interesting for you too, I'm sure, to see how we operate. We expect sort of short, direct answers, so that would be really helpful. But also today we're in for a special treat because we've got our ex officio member, the Minister, the Exchequer Secretary of the Treasury, James Murray, who's just explained to us that his brief in the Treasury is everything to do with tax and the HMRC. So very, very warm welcome, James. We meet twice weekly and we scrutinise every bit of public expenditure we can. So we're in here really to help the Treasury, I think, and hopefully you find our reports useful. So over to you if you'd like to say a few words. We're delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey, and can I congratulate you on being the chair of this committee and welcome all of the new members on this committee as well. As an MP since 2019, I've keenly followed the work of the Public Accounts Committee. I know what an important role it plays and very honoured to be an ex officio member of the committee now. I know what work the PAC does alongside obviously the NAO and the Controller and Auditor General, and how important their work is in supporting value for money, because I think that this committee, as exemplified by me being an ex officio member, is one where we all have common cause to get value for money for taxpayers. It is collaborative in that sense, obviously challenging and robustly critical, as a critical friend in the right way, but we all have the same aim here, which is to make sure public money is spent wisely and that taxpayers' money is spent to the common good. I know that looking at the Treasury minutes, I think that over 90% of the committee's recommendations have been accepted in the past, which I think shows the collaborative nature of the work between the committee and government and how important the work of the committee is. And I certainly hope to continue that tradition of implementing recommendations that the committee comes up with. I think there's also a role for Treasury officials in making sure that other departments report on progress on implementation. So again, that's a way in which the committee can work with Treasury to drive that progress and implementation right across government. I think it's important for me to thank the work of the committee clerks and staff as well in supporting all of the members' work here. I know that as members we tend to front it up, but we can only do it because of the brilliant people supporting us behind the scenes and doing all the detailed and hard work to enable us to do our job. So I'd like to thank them and also the Treasury Officer of Accounts and the team there as a sort of central point of contact in government. So the work the committee does can then be effectively transmitted throughout government. So, I mean, over the years ahead, I look forward very much to working with the committee. Thank you for inviting me along to this first meeting of it. Someone had said to me when they saw I was appointed chair of the HMRC board, which is a new thing, and then I was appointed to this committee, I think they thought I was getting rather greedy in all the different positions, but they're both critical roles for me, as well as the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury sort of principal job around tax policy. For me, being chair of the HMRC board and its focus on delivery is critical, and I see the work of the Public Accounts Committee as fitting into that nexus of driving public sector reform and value for money for taxpayers, which is something we all firmly agree on.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words about the committee, but also I think all the committee would echo your remarks in thanking the CNAG and his staff, and also for Sarah, our clerk, and their staff. It's a big committee, it has 2 public hearings a week, and we couldn't do it without the support of all these excellent people who help us, so thank you for that. We understand you're a very busy man, particularly at the moment. Do stay as little or as long as you want. If you've got pressing engagements, we fully understand. But thank you very much for attending today. We welcome it.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, without any further ado, let us go into our hearing. And Dame Bernadette, I think you've been warned that I wanted to raise at the top the vexed subject of Hammersmith Bridge. I think... thanks very much, Minister, thank you. I think really I'm almost not going to ask a question. I'm just going to let you give us an update, if I may, please.
Yes, of course, and I have been warned of that, so thank you for the advance notice. So I think the key thing to say is that ministers have decided to reconvene now the Hammersmith Bridge Task Force, recognising obviously how important an issue this is to the residents of the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And so we are currently, Simon Lightwood, our Minister for Public Transport, will be joining that task force, and a date is currently being sought for that meeting. More broadly, and I'm sure if Ms Olney was here, she would ask me about funding. We have, as I think the committee knows, provided £13 million of funding previously to ensure that the exploratory and stabilisation works could be done to the bridge. Decisions on further funding will now need to be taken in the context of the next phase of the spending review.
So can I just press you a little bit on that? Because we've had evidence from Transport to London, and they say at present London is ineligible to bid for the large local major programme funded through the National Roads Fund, which allows eligible scheme promoters to bid for funding to cover 85% of the costs. So is that something that, I mean, if they're not allowed to bid for it or they're not eligible to bid for it, is there some other way of funding? Because I think in the last part, if I remember, the sort of proposal was that your department would pay a third, Hammersmith and Fulham Council would pay a third, and TfL would pay a third. And I think the problem with that was, and Sarah Olney, the member for Richmond, who can't be here today, would certainly say this, you know, the idea of asking Hammersmith and Fulham Borough to fund a third, I think is really out with their abilities.
So you're absolutely right. You recall correctly, under the previous government, there had been a broad agreement that funding would be split three ways for the major works, which obviously have yet to happen, between the department, TfL and the borough. Indeed, the borough was looking at how it might raise revenues in order to fund its portion of that cost. I think this government will now need to take a view. I think it probably is correct that London can't bid for major MRN and LNM funding, and that is indeed a source that has been used in some other parts of the country to fund bridge work. So I recognise that. I think we will need to reflect with this government on what the appropriate funding mechanism might be, and as I say, all of that will need to be considered in the spending review. I don't know, Dave, can you say any more on that point?
Yeah, so the Major Road Network / Larger Local Major Programme had a sort of single entry point in 2019, and at that point the decision was taken that London could bid for schemes on the major road network, which is those roads that are most economically important, below the strategic road network that National Highways looked after, but not for large local majors. At the time, it was because of the different financial context in London compared to others. That was a single entry point in 2019. So obviously we haven't run another competition. So to that degree, Hammersmith Bridge could never, because there isn't an opportunity at the moment. Obviously with that programme developing, part of SR Phase 2, due in spring next year, we're thinking about the future of that programme, and particularly things like renewals and the right balance between renewals and enhancements.
I mean, we've got a lot to cover today, but I would just simply say that having Hammersmith Bridge not working does cause considerable disruption in southwest London, and I'm sure if Sarah were here, she would echo that.
I'm sure she would. I'd noted.
So we will. You can expect this committee to keep an eye on that. Before I ask any member to come in, I would remind members that they've got to declare any interest they might have, and they should do that before they actually make a contribution. So, Rachel, you wanted to start, I think, on Stonehenge.
Yes.
Do you have any interest to declare?
Other than the fact that I try to use the 303, no.
Yeah, right, okay.
So my constituency is Tiverton and Minehead, and the 303 is one of the roads that one might choose to get to London on. And the issue around Stonehenge has been a problem for a very long time. And I just wondered where we were in terms of the tunnel and the road and things like that.
So, well, as I am sure members of the committee will have noted, the Chancellor announced on the 29th of June that the government would not now be taking the A303 tunnel scheme forwards. So we are currently, or National Highways is currently implementing a closure plan for that project, so it won't proceed. In terms of the broader challenges, and I too have travelled on the A303. Many people have experienced the congestion. What we would expect is that National Highways will now need to consider this as part of their future work on route strategies, which is the work that generally feeds into subsequent road investment strategies. But I think I would have to say that is some way in the future now. So I say that decision.
Status quo really is.
That is there will not be a major enhancement to the A303.
That's disappointing, but there we are.
Happy?
Well, no.
Well, you pursued it as much as you want to at the moment. Yes, all right. I understand you wouldn't be happy. Of course, Rachel was. Right, we now move into the main hearing, please. I didn't really introduce it properly, but I probably should say a few words about it, if I can find my right piece of paper, which I can't. So today we are looking at the local road network in England, which is essential to everyday travel and the movement of goods. However, despite their importance, the condition of these roads has declined sharply in recent years, and the backlog of repairs is increasing. This is compounded by significant gaps in the data that the Department of Transport gathers on local roads, which hampers its understanding of the scale of the problem, and as well as the complexity of the department's funding arrangements for local authorities carrying out local maintenance and repairs. So that's basically what we're discussing today. I also should, and I'm sorry, Ruth, welcome Ruth Cadbury as the chair of the Department of Transport Select Committee. Very pleased to have you here, and thank you for guesting on our committee today. So, without any further ado, let's move into the main hearing, and Clive Betts will be our first question, please.
Good morning, Dame Bernadette. Why do you think you're the only person in the country that thinks local roads are in a good condition?
So I think you're referring to the fact that our DFT's official data suggests that the sort of condition of local roads, notably A, B and C roads I'm talking about here, has remained broadly stable since 2016. I don't think we would say that necessarily means they're all in good condition, but what our data shows is that the condition has remained, the number of roads or the proportion of roads rated as red, i.e. needing maintenance now, has remained broadly stable, and that's at 4% of A roads and 6% of B and C roads. We fully accept that sort of rather sort of benign headline doesn't really align either with other reports carried out by independent parties or indeed with public perception, and that indeed the condition of local roads is a matter of very significant concern to the public and to MPs, so I want to acknowledge that and say that very firmly. I think possibly part of the reason for our figures suggesting a more stable position than people's experience may be that we have less robust data on the condition of unclassified roads, and they account for 62% by mileage of all local roads. Our data there does suggest some worsening in the condition of those roads, but it is less robust because we collect it on a voluntary basis and over a sort of 4-year rolling average period rather than a 2-year average period, so it may not be as fully up to date. So I think we would acknowledge that there is, we need to reflect and understand that there is a gap between our headline position and what most people's experience of local roads looks and feels like. So I also think I want to say to the committee as well, we recognise that there is room to improve our data on local roads, and we have just issued a new standard, PAS 2161, for local authorities to use in reporting to us on the condition of local roads. And this will do two important things. One, it will require local authorities to provide that data in a more granular way, so rather than 3 categorisations of the quality of roads or condition of roads, it will have 5 categories of road condition, and this is the really important thing, it will enable and indeed we hope encourage local authorities to use a wider variety of new technologies to gather data which will be both more detailed and more robust.
Is that guidance available to local authorities now?
It is. We've issued it in September. We hope that they will begin to use it on a voluntary basis next year.
Why voluntary? If it's so important.
Well, they need time, I think, to adapt to how to ensure that they are able to use the new standard. We obviously hope many of them will use the new standard next year. I might ask Dave to say some more. It will be mandatory from the year after that, which is, I think, 26-27. So we're clearly moving towards this new data standard. It's just a question of ensuring that local authorities are prepared and able to do that.
And there's also, what's happening at the moment is we're piloting it with different technologies to allow us to compare and make sure that we get consistent data from different types of technology. The sort of voluntary year next year will also allow us to compare the two data sets. So what the data is telling us from the scanner and what it's showing us from the new data set, to allow us to see whether we can effectively compare back in time with the scanner data. So that's why it's kind of coming in a rolling basis.
So it'll be 2027 before you know what the state of the roads really are.
So that will be when we get the full data set on this new standard. I mean, I think I suppose the important thing to recognise is ultimately what do we use this data for? Because it's the local authority's responsibility to maintain their network. That's how the such set up. So
you surely got to know what your money's been spent on, otherwise, what's the point of giving it to local authorities?
Exactly. So what we need to understand on a consistent basis is what is the condition out there. What our data is showing us is obviously that it's stable. What people are saying, what people experience is different. I think it's also important to, I suppose, look at the Asphalt Industry Association data, which was obviously raised in the NEO report, because that shows in some ways a similar picture. We've clearly got an increasing backlog. That's what the AIA shows in one part of its report. But on the road condition side, what it shows is, again, a quite a consistent picture over the last 3 years, where 11% of roads have been, in England and Wales, have been red. So there is a conundrum in here, in that what data that we're collecting, what data that AIA is collecting, is showing a consistent picture, but that's not how people are feeling. And I think what the new standard will allow us is to kind of get into that and really see why is the data not showing us what people think and what we feel.
The UK Road Leadership Group, body which the DFD chair, has got national, local government and others involved in it. Their data says that the roads are deteriorating. So why is the conflict with the data you have?
And I think I think what our data shows us is the surface condition. There's many other bits to the overall condition of the road, in terms of structures, in terms of footways, in terms of lighting poles. So I think we acknowledge that the data we collect is only a portion of it. And what it isn't, and we acknowledge this, which is why we did pass 2161, that it's not good enough to show us what we want to see, which is why we've done the work that we've done.
You're going to continue to compare the data you collect in that way, or in the new way, with public satisfaction, because in the end, the public that use the roads, and they're showing increasing dissatisfaction.
Yes, and obviously there's other data points like insurance data in terms of damage from potholes. So we're looking at all of this data to try and get the right picture, because ultimately what we use this data for is to make the minister's gone, but we make a pitch to the Treasury in terms of what's the right funding level, and also as a means for local authorities to identify how well they are doing. So we fully recognise that if that data is not good enough, it makes that job of getting the funding that we need hard.
Why is it taking so long to realise the data is not good enough?
So I think we've obviously the development of PAS 2161 has been a number of years of work already. So we have recognised for quite a while that it needs improving. But instituting a new standard that is consistent across the piece that will allow takes time, which is frustrating. So it's not that we've only just recently realised that there's a problem, but coming to a consistent solution does take time.
And local authorities generally in agreement with the new standards?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really welcomed. I think the local authorities and the sector in general think it's a really good thing. I think Scanner had its moment, but it's a technology from the 1980s. New technologies have come along. Scanner is a single technology, whereas there are many other technologies out there. So it opens up the market and allows innovation and allows us to get to better data.
And we know many local authorities are already doing innovative things with new technology, all sorts of visual imaging, etc. Can be done now. That hasn't been possible historically, and we know they're doing that, and they're using it to inform their own assessment because of how they fulfil their statutory duties, and indeed how they allocate all of the funding that they spend on road maintenance, which goes well beyond the funding that we DFT provide. So a lot of this technology is already being trialled and piloted. As Dave says, I think the important thing is we now have a national standard which will ensure that local authorities are able to more consistently do innovative approaches which will give us better data.
If I might also add, I think there's always a trade-off too and a balance to be struck between how much data we demand from local authorities and how much they actually collect. I think there are limits through MHCLG's single data list of how much of a burden we can impose on local authorities. A lot of them do collect their own very rich data, but there are sort of restrictions and limits on how much data we can demand from them to minimise the burden on them.
So, Dave Bernadette, you probably gathered in the sort of subtext there's a little bit of consternation about, and we're delighted you have announced and tell us about PAS 61, but I think it's the sort of first time we've been aware of it. So when did this all come about?
Well, the work will have been going on for some period of time, I don't doubt. So I'm not sure. I think this is the first time that I've certainly appeared before this committee, and as you know, I've been around a little while to talk about local roads maintenance. But the work will have been in gestation for some time.
In the public domain?
Yes.
It is in the public domain.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay.
Indeed.
It's in the NAO report.
We hadn't published it, I think, at the time the NAO did the work on their report. So it's been published more recently than the NAO report, but
that's a helpful clarification. I think individual colleagues, Chris Kane, you've got questions around this, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. You're going from 3 measurements to 5.
Yeah.
That's of interest. That's why is 5 the right number? And also, when were the local authorities involved in designing this? And also, what information can they provide now, which doesn't create an additional burden of moving to a different standard? So is there more that we could get quicker if local authorities could provide what they already have?
So on the 5 categories, let me just explain what they are, and then I might ask Dave to say a bit more about how we've worked with local authorities in developing this. So we had 3, which was red, amber, green rating system under the previous standard, which reflected no further treatment required, maintenance required soon, or red should be considered for maintenance now. The 5 new categories are no deterioration, minor deterioration, and then moderate to severe, and severe deterioration. I think 5 is, we're trying to strike a balance here. It's something that's manageable, but something that gives enough detail and granularity for appropriate targeting of work. I've absolutely no doubt local authorities have been extensively involved in developing it, so I'll ask Dave to say more about that.
Yeah, so I think on the 5, I think one of the concerns from the sector in the 3 model that we have is that there's a bow wave of roads right up at the amber-red border that the data doesn't show, but basically authorities are just keeping roads out of the red. And so that could explain, I suppose, why perception of the data isn't quite lining up. So having the 5 will allow you to see that that top end of amber a bit more and see if that is what local authorities are doing, so that the sort of deterioration is not amber moving into red, it's stuff at the bottom of amber now being right at the top of amber. So that's, and as Bernadette says, you've got to have a manageable number of different segments, and we think this gives us that kind of insight that we need. Local authorities and the technology sector have been working on this throughout with our team's stats, so that everyone buys into this, everyone thinks this is the right thing to do. On the point that, yes, local authorities do have a lot more data already, using different technologies, could they share that with us? I think the issue is about comparability of the data. Everyone is using apart from Scanner, where authorities are collecting data using different technologies, they've got different technologies to suit their personal needs. And what the work on PAS 2161 has shown is that the comparability of data from different technologies is quite broad. There's quite a broad variation. So we could, subject to kind of it being all right with MHCLG in terms of single data, we could collect all this data, but being able to compare it and give a national picture, it wouldn't do that purpose, which is why we've gone down this route, because it will give us a consistent national picture that is richer and so help.
And as Dave said, that's really vital for us to have to inform advice to ministers on what is the appropriate sort of funding level for local roads maintenance provided through national government. So that's the sort of what do we do with that data? We sort of form a view about the national condition of the roads in England and what that suggests for the need for central government investment to support local authorities.
This raises a lot of issues on this whole hearing. I think it would. Other members are just going to come in briefly in a minute, but I don't want to spend the whole committee, although bits of it will come out subsequently. I wonder if it would be possible to have a note, and I wonder if the note would tell us what consultations you've had with local authorities so far on the detail. Precisely what data you are going to collect, so we can have data on the whole system on a consistent basis from every local authority, and whether they're able to give you that data in that consistent form, and if not now, when. I think that would be really, really helpful. And what the financial implications of this all are. I think, Rebecca, you had a...
May I just clarify,
of course, absolutely.
Please, Chair, just so we can respond with what... You said what the financial implications of this are. Do you mean the financial implications of transitioning from one data requirement to another data requirement for local authorities?
Precisely.
Okay, yeah. we can work through that.
Rebecca Poole.
Thank you. I'd just firstly like to disclose that I'm a county councillor at Surrey County Council. Firstly, I just want to say that the roads are not in good condition. It's something that comes up a huge amount. The data piece is really, really important, but I also think we need to get the balance right. So we know we've got a massive backlog. We know a huge amount of work needs to be done in order to get our roads up to standard. But what we need to not do is tie up our local authorities with bureaucracy and reporting rather than actually getting on with the job. So I think I'd really like to understand from you how you're going to get to a position where we have the data we need in order to do that, but without actually distracting from the job at hand. And it would also be good just to maybe understand a little bit more about the technology you think that could be used, because I think often technology can be a real solution here, and we do have vehicles that are travelling our roads every day, and I'm not an expert in this, but I would imagine rubbish collection vehicles. We do have vehicles that are going across the road surface across the entire country where we've got residences, and I just wonder what your thinking is in terms of taking the pressure off local authorities so they can do what they need to do, but we have the data we need.
I mean, I'll make a general point, but it's really to echo the point that Rupert made. We are really, really cognizant when we are thinking about local roads maintenance and the information that we ask for from local authorities about the need to strike exactly the balance you say. This committee and others rightly expect us as a department and the government to have an understanding of the condition of local roads, and we must collect data in order to have that understanding. But it is principally the statutory responsibility of local authorities to maintain those roads, and we don't want to kind of bury them in bureaucracy. And conscious decisions, and I think this was reflected in the NAO report, have been made in the past to limit, or at least sort of be quite prescribed in the data that we ask for from local authorities, precisely for the reason that we don't want to place undue burdens with them. And of course, Mr. Betts in particular will be particularly familiar that that's a broader part of how the government's framework of accountability for local authorities works. So that's very much in the front of our minds. But I don't know, Dave, if you can say more on the points, the other points Ms. Paul has raised.
So as Bernadette says, sort of burden on local authorities is a big issue that we're very aware of. And what PAS 2161 will do, we believe, is reduce those burdens, because at the moment you have a situation where local authorities potentially collect data in one way, using one technology for their own sort of operational purposes, and then collect scanner data to feed us, which is kind of ridiculous. What PAS 2161 will mean is that a local authority can choose the technology it needs for its operational purposes, and then, as long as it's accredited, that will be able to be used for our national statistics. And in terms of the technologies that are out there that we are kind of currently testing and piloting, there's quite a lot that are camera-based. So a company called Geist up in Yorkshire basically have vehicles fitted out with cameras that can drive along, scan the road and the footways and other sort of not just the carriageway, and then compile, and then that will be translated into condition data. So I think Blackpool are already using that kind of data because Scanner doesn't like tram tracks, so it confuses tram tracks with cracks in the road. So all of these technologies have their limitations. Other local authorities are using what's called Visala AI, which uses cameras on non-dedicated vehicles, so like rubbish trucks or other vehicles that are regularly going around the roads, and uses that feed to compile condition data. And there's many other kind of potential technologies out there. All vehicles collect a huge amount of information on ride and suspension, and there's some companies thinking about how they can aggregate that from manufacturers and potentially give you some condition data as well. So I think that's one of the really exciting things about PAS 2161. It opens up a huge number of opportunities and should reduce burdens on local authorities.
Could I just ask you, Mr. Buttery, does that technology and does this new system include things like bridges and footpaths and so on? Because we've had a lot of evidence from interest groups. Bridges are hugely expensive for local authorities, and my local authority in particular in Gloucester is concerned about this. Footways are hugely important to people, particularly with physical and mental impairments. So will this whole system and your technology include those?
So PAS 2161 is just the carriageway in terms of the standard and in terms of the data that we ask for local authorities. The technologies that are out there do a variety of things. So the Geist technology does collect footways as it's going along. I'm not sure if it's the same technology, but Geist do also have a tunnel condition technology as well. Obviously, the conscious choice that was made back in 2016 was to stop collecting national data on bridges. So one of the things we need to think about looking forward, taking into account very much the burdens on local authorities, are we collecting all of the data that we need? At the moment, we're just doing carriageway. As you say, footways are very important for our ambitions on active travel, as well as being real barriers for people who have mobility impairments. And I know the Secretary of State is very...
We'll be coming back to that probably in the hearing. We'll certainly want to involve you, Mr. Furness, in that discussion on those sorts of interest groups. I think we'll now, if we can, just turn to Michael on the last question on this particular aspect.
Thank you, Chair. Can I first of all declare an interest as a member of Nottinghamshire County Council and a Vice President of the Local Government Association? DFT's data shows that local road conditions, and I think you said this, Dame Bernadette, are in roughly the same position that they have been in recent years, but yet the NAO report points out that there is a £15.6 billion backlog in roads maintenance, and it also shows that the DFT's own data shows that the number of the length of roads is declining every year in terms of the amount of roads that are maintained. Can you understand people's frustration and confusion in those 2 points being made? Because only one of those can be true, can't it?
Yeah, and I do completely, and I think we've acknowledged that, and I want to continue to reiterate in the sense that we are not here saying that we think there has been no deterioration in road condition over recent years. I think there is enough broader information to tell us that cannot be entirely true, or certainly is not the full picture. So hence the need to improve the data, but also, as I say, the recognition that where our data is much less robust is unclassified roads, which are 62% are the roads that probably most people are experiencing most of the time. So I acknowledge that. I think the backlog figure quoted in the NAO report is an Asphalt Industries Alliance figure, so it's not independently verified by the department, but we would recognise that there is a significant backlog. The last time we formally assessed it, and I don't think we would say it was a high confidence assessment, but we did do some work on this in 2019 and did conclude there was a significant backlog of work then, and I would expect that given the very severe weather conditions, particularly very wet winters we've had, that will have expanded since then. I was very interested in those numbers that I think you're referring to in the NAO report, which I think show fewer miles of maintenance by local authorities than previously. And we've been reflecting on that in the context of the work on the NAO report. And there could be, I think, potentially a number of things going on there. One is, I suspect it may be that actually local authorities are doing road maintenance in more efficient and better ways. There could be some positive sort of steps going on there. It is also the case that we know that although the government's funding, it's been a bit lumpy, but it's been in absolute terms, cash terms, sort of similar, but we know the value of that, given inflationary impacts, particularly on the construction industry, means it's been less in real terms for local authorities. So I think there are a number of different things, but I mean, Dave, do you want to add to that, or Rupert?
Or shall I? Because you're right, there could be several reasons why the total amount of mileage being maintained by local authorities is declining. It could be, as Bernadette says, that they are repairing fewer miles but to a higher standard. It could be that they're using their funding to look after assets like tunnels and bridges instead, because our guidance to local authorities has been to move away from an approach where they're simply looking at patching potholes along miles of roads to a more sort of asset management approach where they're looking at the whole of their networks. And also, even though the overall spend by local authorities has been broadly stable over the last decade or so, of course there have been inflation pressures as well, which so I think all of those factors could explain why the total mileage is reducing.
If I may just press just on this point briefly, Chair. The concerning thing, I mean, I hear all of that, and from my own experience as a county councillor and somebody who drives on the roads, I absolutely get that there could be different reasons. I think the concerning thing is they're all could-be's, maybes, they're not definites. And the concern, I think, in the NAO report is it makes clear that you're going to have this new programme for monitoring of roads, but it says, and I quote, DFT will not require local authorities to increase the proportion of the network they monitor each year. So how is the department going to assure itself that the significant amount of taxpayers' money is being used in a valuable fashion, given some of the things you've just said about the maybes, the might-be's, about the amount of roads that are being maintained declining each year? How are you going to assure yourselves that taxpayers' money is being spent in a valuable fashion if you're not going to be asking local authorities to monitor a higher proportion of their roads each year and therefore improve the data set that you've got?
So I think there's always a balance to be struck here between, as Ms Paul says, the burden you put on local authorities in terms of reporting, as opposed to ensuring that we are allocating our money efficiently and getting value for money for it. The approach that we've set up is sort of focused on the roads that are used most frequently. So there's a higher data burden on A roads that then obviously declines down to U roads. I think that the challenge for us is that what we all think is that the sort of the deterioration that people see and feel is probably on those U roads, because while they're not the most heavily trafficked, they are the ones that start and end most journeys. There's the road outside your house. And so if there's a pothole there, you see it every day, it becomes much more totemic in a way that it's not here. So we've consciously taken an approach that is based on usage and trying to balance that with local authority reporting burdens. I think the other thing, so we've maintained that. We're happy to look at it, but we need to think about the impact that will have on local authorities, because obviously particularly large local authorities with lots of U roads, that's quite a big reporting burden if you change that approach. But I do think we do have an issue around the EU roads, because and again this comes back to your point that it's just might be, could be, my conjecture is that because it's a rolling average over 4 years, effectively that will downplay deterioration. So so you'll only start to see a fuller picture in a number of years. So I think that is an issue, that is a problem. PAS 2161, once it's implemented and we see a bit more the impact that it has on local authorities in terms of the reporting burden, whether it does actually free up burden, does potentially give us a scope to increase it. But I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're in a world in which we are wanting to put more burdens on local authorities. And I think, as Bernadette said earlier, we also need to step back and recognise that it's the local authority who is responsible for the road and the local authority who is making those decisions about how they maintain their network and what is the priority for them. So I think there's a bit of a risk that we don't want to move into a position where we determine and decide how a local authority maintains its roads.
Because we've got a lot to cover. And fascinating all this is, I mean, you've got a great passion for roads, I can see that, but we're not going to get through everything if we have too long an answer. Now, Dame Bernadette, I don't mind who answers this question, whether you or Dave or whoever does, but we are very keen on measuring things in this committee. You can only measure things if you know what the baseline, the status quo now is. So I want to really get to the bottom of Michael Payne's question about the backlog, and I want to go to paragraph 13 on page 9. And bearing in mind this is an agreed report between the NAO and yourselves, and I quote that the middle bit of that paragraph. DFT estimated the backlog would be between 7.6 billion and 11.7 billion, and in 2234 estimates by the Asphalt Industry Alliance put the backlog of 15.6 billion, including London, and those are very big variances. What is your best estimate as a department of what the best backlog is?
So the last time we estimated the backlog was in 2019, and it was, as the NAO report states, at that point we had a range of 7.6 billion to 11.7 billion. We have not subsequently done an analysis to calculate the backlog. So that is simply where we are. We don't annually calculate a backlog. What we annually do is look at the condition of the roads as reported by local authorities. So I don't know if there's anything.
Well, it's also quite hard to define what we mean by a backlog. So I think we accept that it is very significant, whatever the precise number.
The problem is, if we don't get to some rough idea of what the backlog is, how do we have a rough idea of what money needs to go in to solve it? Now, if it was between 7.6 and 11.7 in 2019, it's got to be at least that level now. Is it that level, 11.7 billion, or is it nearer the Asphalt Association's level of 15.6?
I can't give you a number. It would be wrong to try and suggest that I can. I think, again, just observed impact since suggest it's likely to be higher. As I say, we know we've had particularly bad winters for the roads, so I would estimate that it is higher. And obviously, we have the Asphalt Industries estimate as an independent industry source, but I can't give you another DFT figure for that.
Okay, but we can bear that in mind when we come on to questions on funding. That would be really helpful. Rachel Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to the issue about pavements, if at the moment you're only looking at road surfaces, there's a very real danger that the pavements and cycleways are not in a condition which support the objectives, which are your objectives, about accessibility and active travel. And we have received some information from the National Federation of the Blind, and I attended one of their meetings not very long ago, and they are concerned about the issue of floating bus stops, which is not your concern, but they're also concerned about that although tactile paving isn't a high priority, but it does provide essential safety and accessibility for blind and visually impaired people. And it would be good to understand that, just to be able to measure, we're going to talk a lot about measurements today, to measure the state of pavements and how they fit your own objectives, but particularly bearing in mind the impact it has on the ability of people with impaired sight to actually leave their own homes. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about freedom of movement for people who, at the moment, cannot use pavements because they're in such poor condition, and you don't know about that.
Yeah, so I mean, again, so on cycleways, it is right that we don't collect separate data on the condition of cycleways. However, the data that we collect on the carriageway will collect data on all of the cycleways that are just demarked by lines, not segregated, because the standard requires the outside lanes to be sort of assessed. So that data will give us an indication about cycle lane sort of condition. I agree it's not universal. You're right, we do not collect data on footways. Clearly the local authority will and should, to fulfil its duty to kind of maintain the highway. And so we come back to the question about what is the right burden and, I suppose, position of the national government versus local government in this area. You know, me, in my heart of hearts, I would love to have that data and be able to kind of use it and enrich it, but I recognise that actually every department wants information from local authorities, and we need to strike a balance. And clearly that balance has been struck where we currently are on the single data list. Clearly we're doing a lot of work through Active Travel England, which obviously covers both cycling and walking, to work with local authorities to build their capacity in active travel, both cycling and walking, and clearly the pavement is a key part of that. So that is our way of influencing and funding local authorities to improve that. Active Travel England are working with local authorities to try and get a national picture of cycleways, because we can't say where they are, nobody can. They're trying to do that, but you're right, we recognise there's more to do, and it's really important to meet our target of 50% of short journeys being by walking and cycling.
I'm getting quite frustrated by this burden business, because in my mind, you are accountable for the state of the roads. Ultimately, you are accountable for the state of the road. You can't keep on saying it's up to local authorities and we've got to put the burden on them. I just think, you know, I'm a new MP. I'm an MP for a Devon-Somerset constituency. There are roads in my constituency that people can't drive on. There aren't very many A roads. They are the B roads and the U roads. And I'm just finding this whole experience, in trying to find some accountability for my constituents who are taxpayers. I'm not finding that accountability, I'm afraid, today, whether we're talking about roads or cycle paths or anything else. So I'm just expressing my profound frustration, and I really think you've got to up your game. Let's move on to bridges.
Bridges, before we do move on to bridges, I want to bring in, please, Rupert Furness, because you are the Deputy Director of Local Highways and Active Travel, and Mr. Buttery has referred to the 50% journey targets in urban areas being walked or cycled by 2030, and Sustrans has put in evidence to us and saying, however, without maintenance funding, this investment will have limited impact. And it will make that target much more difficult to reach. Do you want to just say something about, because that's a clearly very important target, it's a very ambitious target, but without the maintenance of cycleways and footpaths that Rachel Gilmore has been talking about, it ain't going to happen, is it?
Yeah. Well, I think absolutely we accept that it's really, really important to maintain pavements and cycleways properly to enable more people to make their journeys on foot or by bike. Clearly the extra funding that the government has announced for next financial year, both for highway maintenance and for active travel infrastructure, will allow local authorities to start making improvements both to their cycleways, footways as well. But yes, you're right, there are very clear connections between these two agendas, which is why I'm quite glad that they both sit within my team. So yes, in short, I accept the very important link between maintenance spend and people's ability to use pavements and cycleways.
Can I just make a broader point? Well, firstly, I think you raised some important points about accessibility, and I just want to emphasise that is something that Secretary of State, and I think she made this clear in her remarks last week before the Transport Select Committee, is extremely focused on. It is a very high priority for her. It will be at the heart of our integrated transport strategy, which will be really looking at the end-to-end journeys that people experience. As you say, you step out of your home and you're immediately experiencing the transport network, and we need to ensure that people with disabilities and impairments can do that as freely as others. So to that general point, I just want to give you that reassurance. I do think the point of accountability and your frustration is one that I want to respond to as well. It is the law that local authorities have a statutory responsibility to maintain local roads. And so they do have a very clear legal duty, and indeed they do allocate very significant funding, which does not come from the Department for Transport. So 3/4 of the road, of the money that local authorities spend maintaining their roads, if you look at capital and revenue together, does not come from DFT. It comes from other sources. Yeah. So I think all we're trying to do, equally, we fully recognise the responsibility that national government has for looking in the round at the state of our local roads and ensuring that national government is playing its part, both in allocating national funding, in ensuring that we have appropriate data and know what is going on, and in supporting then local authorities to do their jobs as effectively as possible. It is just that there is, as it were, there are different accountabilities here. So we're not trying to say that there is no accountability. I just think we need to be clear. Local authorities have certain accountabilities. We in DFT and national government have accountabilities, and it's a sort of mixed market when it comes to local roads condition.
I understand the statutory responsibility that local government has, but I think it's a very difficult thing to explain to the people that actually pay their taxes.
I completely understand that.
And certainly in my patch constituency, the roads are, to use the word diabolical would be quite kind.
I completely understand, by the way, that the public doesn't care whether it's local government or national government. They just want their roads to be better.
Just a second, Rachel, and you're raising very good points, which I totally agree with. Look, it's all very well to shuffle the legal responsibility onto local authorities, but let me just see. You'll curse them, I'm sure, by the end of the hearing. The Asphalt Industry Alliance says to us in evidence, local authority highway teams are faced with a thankless task. They have a legal responsibility to keep our roads safe, yet haven't had the funds to do so in a cost-effective, proactive, and sustainable way. So, I mean, your department has the ultimate responsibility for this.
So I don't know if you want to move on to funding now. I don't want to sort of preempt that part of your questions, but I sort of think I want to. There's a couple of points in response to the quote you just give. So if you look at the totality of funding that is spent on local roads maintenance, it is about 4.4 billion a year, and that has actually been steady in real terms, real terms, i.e. adjusted for inflation, over the last decade or so. Of that, about 1.2 billion in the current year comes from DFT. Of course, the government has announced a 500 million uplift in the amount that will be allocated to local authorities next year. And I think, and I hope, that signals very clearly the importance that this government attaches to roads and local road conditions, and the sort of priority that it wishes to give to funding this work. So, but there is, again, the funding that we provide is only part of what local authorities invest in the condition of their roads.
Okay. Rachel Gilner, I'm very sorry to keep interrupting you, but you now go on to bridges, which your authority and mine are very concerned about the cost about.
Yes, because there's the big modern bridges, and then there's the little ones where, they were built for carts and horses, and now you've got enormous lorries driving over them. And bridges are famously very, very expensive to repair, and yet you've got no data on bridges. So how do you work out how you're going to manage and plan an expenditure if you don't have any data on the condition of bridges?
So you're right. A decision was taken back in 2016 to stop collecting data on bridges. Unfortunately, I'm going to mention the burden word again. I'm sorry. It was due to a decision at that time to reduce reporting burdens. That's Since that point, the RAC Foundation and ADEPT, the Association of Directors of Environment, Planning and Transport, so those bits of local authorities, have been doing surveys of local authorities. So there is information out there on a national level on the number of what they term substandard bridges in Great Britain. Their definition as a substandard is a bridge that won't take a 44-tonne lorry. So to your point about very old bridges, those were never designed to take 44 tonnes. So they would appear as substandard, but no local authority would ever need or want to improve them. But what that data shows is, again, slightly counterintuitive. It's back to the world where the last survey was the lowest reported level of substandard bridges since they've been doing it in 2016. So 4% of bridges were substandard. The numbers have basically held broadly steady, fluctuating between 4% last year and 4.6%. So again, it shows a picture of things being static. And I think, like you, that doesn't quite feel what I'm hearing from local authorities and what I'm hearing about the world. But that is the data. So there is some data out there. I would, again, coming back to what I would like, I would love to have better data to understand this issue in more detail. Clearly, in terms of how we allocate the funding does have a proportion of it. So 15% of the funding is allocated in terms of bridges, and that's done on the number of bridges that a local authority has. So in that sense, we know how much money to give because we know how many bridges. Clearly, the counterpoint is, well, you don't know how many bridges are in a bad condition as opposed to in a good condition, and that is true. But clearly, in giving a proportion for all of the bridges, it's then for the local authority to manage and determine how that money is spent across their asset categories.
Okay, just to be clear, you do want, you aspire to have data on bridges. Would that be accurate? From
a personal perspective, yes. Clearly, I then need to set that in the context of what are all of the things that we're asking local authorities for.
I think there's a slight gloss on what you've said, Mr. Buttery, because if you turn to paragraph 1.9 in the report, which is an agreed report, I would remind you, on page 18, it says 4% of bridges in England, totaling around 2,300, were in substandard condition. It then goes on to say, DFT analysis following a 2016 National Flood Resilience Review identified 11,000 bridges on the A road network that are vulnerable to failure in severe weather event. So this whole subject of bridges is really quite serious, isn't it? And given the fact that they are so expensive to maintain.
Yes. No. I mean, they are a key risk item. So I would not in any way say that we are complacent about it. Clearly, what you measure, there's different measures. The substandard is clearly just about whether it can take a 44-tonne truck or not. Whether it's resilient to flooding and how it will be affected by climate change is a kind of a different risk factor. And as you say, we've got less good information there, and that is clearly an area where there's a lot of focus at the moment. You spoke earlier about the UK Road Leadership Group. They've recently formed a special adaptation, biodiversity and climate board to specifically look at what are the highways issues around adaptation to ensure that we've got better guidance and better sort of attention and thoughts on that very important issue.
Ms. Gilmore, have you...
I'm flabbergasted. The whole thing, I just find it flabbergasting, to be honest. I'm learning.
Okay. Well, thank you. Ruth Cadbury,
yes,
Chairman of the Transport Select Committee.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for letting me guest today. Before we finish this section of questions on data collection, could the DFT not collect the data via the regular reporting that DHL, DLUC, or has the local government...
MCLG.
Yeah, MCLG, sorry. MCLG collects data regularly, so could DFT not ask for data via that route, or by attaching reporting requirements to the funding, the £1 billion a year you fund, or even as a one-off in preparation for spending review?
So these are all very good questions, and I think, clearly now we're in the process of beginning to reflect on what future funding arrangements are going to look like. This government will want to consider that in the next phase of the spending review. And this is one of the areas of spending that's also being considered in the context of integrated settlements and so forth, sort of consolidation of government funding for local authorities. And we're having a very active dialogue with MHCLG, therefore, about how this will be funded and what form that funding will take. And, of course, how much funding is something we'll also be having a very active debate about in the spending review negotiation. So that is most definitely an opportunity for us to think and review and reflect on what is the data, what is the kind of information that we need. I think, for example, one of the things we would like to get better information on is sort of outcomes as well as inputs from local authorities. So I think
let's move on to I'll come on to that in a moment.
So there's definitely a live set of questions for us, and I think we will have that dialogue. And we also know we did an evaluation of the one of our potholes funds with local authorities, and they actually expressed a willingness to provide more data. Sometimes local authorities complain that central government is asking for too much, because they, I think, genuinely see this as a very important activity and a sort of joint endeavour of national and local government. I think this is an area where they may well be willing to provide more data if that helps them. Helps us to help them and helps them to do their jobs better.
Just a second, I see Mr. Furness wants to come in fairness. Just sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Cadbury. Do you want to
just one very brief thing to add, that you alluded to the increase in funding that we're providing, whether that gives us the opportunity to ask for more data. That is something our ministers are already really interested in, whether that extra funding next year gives us a good opportunity to tie those additional funding allocations to more data requirements.
Having spent 25 years as an elected councillor, providing data is not a burden if A, it helps you benchmark, indeed, and B, it's going to help you get resources from various sources for your local authority area. But can I just ask, you said there's a live conversation with MCLG about this data. Have you asked them to include this data so that they can collect it in order to help you do your job?
So the condition data that we currently get is on MHCLG's single data list. So that is the route by which we get it from local authorities. The focus previously has always been on sort of maintaining and not expanding that list, which is why in the previous exercise, the data that we did collect, again through that route on bridges, was taken out. That was an attempt to reduce the amount of reporting that's coming from local authorities. As Bernadette says, the conversations we're now having with MHCLG are around integrated settlements, outcome frameworks, what does that look like? And clearly data and data reporting is a key part of that. So those conversations are happening but not yet concluded.
Okay. Thank you. Shall I go on to outcomes, Chair?
Yes, please.
Dame Bernadette, the Department for Transport funds local authorities for local roads to the tune of about £1 billion a year, despite the different contradictions about the level of how bad our roads, footways and cycleways are. I think we're all agreed they're in a terrible state. Our constituents certainly would. And you yourself agreed with just about everybody that the situation's getting worse. So, what outcomes are you looking for to achieve from the funding that you provide to local authorities for local roads?
So what we are currently doing is reflecting with our new ministers, relatively new, I should say, and not so new now, on how they wish to define those sorts of outcomes for the future. And that's, as I say, work that we're doing both in the context of allocating the 500 million, which was announced in the budget of additional funding for next financial year for local authorities. And it will be also part of the conversation we are having in the spending review about what we want to see beyond that. So I don't have an answer for you today, but I think we will be looking to work out what is the right set of metrics based on the data we have to measure those outcomes.
I think that's right. There's a very live discussion going on possible metrics. I think we need to be very careful that any metric doesn't lead to unintended consequences. So, for example, if we had a metric solely focused on carriageway condition, that might then detract local authorities from looking at bridges, which, as has already been said, are a hugely important part of the local highway network. So we need to make sure that the outcome framework didn't drive wrong behaviours, if you like, and was genuinely a kind of cross-cutting outcome framework.
Thank you. So if you don't actually currently have a good understanding of the outcomes that have been delivered from the funding you've provided, how can you discharge your responsibilities as the accounting officer?
So we do have an understanding based on the data we currently collect, although obviously we've acknowledged there are opportunities to improve the data. So we are we do have data which gives us a guide to what is happening to the condition of local roads. My responsibility as accounting officer is to ensure that the value for money of our expenditure is good, and actually all of the analysis, and we've done a lot over the years of the value for money of local roads expenditure, is that it is very high value for money. A recent economic appraisal that we've done of this, I think the NAO report quotes our assessment as the return on every pound spent on local roads is £7. We've done a more recent economic appraisal. It's not as robust or as it doesn't have as high a confidence level. That actually suggests a return is higher than that. It's £9 for every £1 of money spent. So this is an area where I am confident that the money that we spend and that the money that we allocate to local authorities is actually delivering good value for money for taxpayers. I mean, as I say, we have a lot of analysis which demonstrates that. It's one of our highest value areas of financial investment, I would say.
And of course, local authorities have their own local government accountability framework, which is all about ensuring that they are delivering value for money with every pound of taxpayers' money that they spend. So there are very strong rules on local authorities to drive better value and ensure they are delivering excellent value for money with what we give them.
Okay, and as you're developing your outcomes matrix, can we be assured that footways and cycleways have as high a billing as carriageways, and you've mentioned bridges? Because
well, we hear the committee's clear, and your role obviously as the Transport Select Committee interest in that. That's clearly something that we and ministers will want to reflect on and think about how we capture how we do our work in future in a way that recognises those issues and concerns.
Okay, and one final one from me on the spending review. If you haven't got sufficient information to understand the current condition of roads or the impact of the funding that you already provide, how do you use the evidence to inform the spending review for the local maintenance funding, road maintenance funding?
So obviously we'll always have a debate and a negotiation with Treasury about what the appropriate level of funding for local roads is, and as you would expect, we will make a strong case. I think we can do that, I think, based on the evidence and the data that we do have, the evidence and the data that the various independent sources like the AIA and RAC bring to bear. And I think also the sort of very clear evidence that firstly the condition of local roads is vital to a huge range of transport outcomes, and I don't think Treasury colleagues would argue, even the most hawkish of them, with that. We know it is very good value for money, and we know it is something that the public really cares about. So I think I would like to think that we will be in a strong position. Obviously, fiscal constraints are what they are for the whole of government, and so we will always be making our arguments for maintenance in that context. But I believe that we will be able to make a good case for the importance of local roads funding. As I say, the fact that this 500 million has been announced demonstrates already that that is, I think, understood. And we'll continue to have that debate. I would say more generally to the committee, one of the things, we are having a debate with Treasury all the time on infrastructure investment, but our position as a department is you have to start by maintaining the assets you have. That is the number one responsibility, is to maintain our assets, whether it's the railways, the strategic rail network or our local roads network. And we have to get that sort of baseline right before we can really think about where are the opportunities to build new.
And we do have very good evidence from some local authorities of the benefits of long-term sustained funding and how that can drive efficiency. So we've got really good data from some excellent authorities, including Surrey, that you mentioned earlier on, of the efficiencies that can be delivered when you have a multi-year framework in place.
Thank you. I bet.
Yes, moving on then to funding at local level. And just to declare, I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. How many pots of money do local authorities currently get to spend on local road maintenance?
I'll start. I think the NEA report sets out the pots from national government, which I think it says up to 12 at various points with varying amounts funded through them over the last 10 years. There's obviously that table in the report, which I don't have to hand, but shows that there have been multiple points from pots from national government. They also allocate funding, capital funding from their own locally derived sources, and they also receive revenue funding, principally via MHCLG's revenue support grant, but also locally derived sources. So there are a range of different sources of funding for local authorities.
Bit of a mess, isn't it?
I wouldn't argue that this is the most streamlined way to fund local roads. No, and I think
diplomatic answer. So.
Yeah. I think certainly we absolutely see the case that at least in relation to the national funding which we in DFT provide, there are strong arguments for simplification and consolidation in order to allow local authorities to spend that, to sort of receive that money and therefore spend it more efficiently. And indeed we know that in practice they treat a lot of our pots, the pots that they receive from DFT, as a kind of single source. Once the money sort of reaches the local authority, they're not really that bothered about whether it's come from the National Highways block or the block.
Do you monitor it?
It's an interesting question how much we try and ring-fence different funds and tie them to very particular activities. And again, I think that's a debate that we need to have, because we want local authorities to be able to sort of spend money in the most efficient way, which usually means flexibilities. But as the last part of this discussion has illustrated, we also need to be confident that it is being spent on the things that we have allocated it to.
How much time do you spend then trying to look at the pots of money you're allocating and looking at how they're spent and what particular value those individual pots give?
So in terms of, clearly we allocate annually, so there's an annual process of calculating the different amounts. As Bernadette says, once it gets through a local authority, it gets to them as a non-ring-fence grant, and so in theory, a local authority can use it on anything it wants. What the data we get from MHCLG shows is that consistently local authorities spend, 3 times as much as their own money as what we give them on road maintenance. So we're confident that the fact that it's non-ring fenced doesn't mean that it's getting diverted. Local road maintenance is clearly a very important local issue, and so we have confidence that it goes to them for those purposes. Beyond that, and again, coming back to what Bernadette says about statutory responsibility, we're not seeking to impose conditions on this much money needs to be used for exactly that purpose. It's for the local authority to determine how it wants to maintain those roads to get the outcomes that they want. So I suppose we don't, probably to answer your question directly, we don't agonise significantly over how each different pot is used by each different local authority. And we don't get reporting back from local authorities on exactly how much money of each pot they've used for what thing.
It's all a bit of a waste of time, isn't it?
As Bernadette says, I think there's efficiencies to be gained.
Yes, okay, right, yes.
It's a system that's evolved organically over the years as different bits of funding have been announced by previous governments. And you're right, in the current financial year we have a highway maintenance block needs element, a highway maintenance block, incentive element, and a pothole fund element. In practice, local authorities treat those as one and the same thing. And we might come back to the incentive element later, I suspect, in some of your questions. But we don't ask them, as Dave says, for separate data.
In order to knock this particular problem on the head, you've hinted strongly, Dame Bernadette, that you think that there should be consolidation in all these budgets. Is that likely to happen, and if so, when?
We will look at the case for consolidation. Ultimately, decisions will need to be taken by ministers. We hear the arguments. I think very fragmented funding generally is not a good way to allocate funding for this activity. I think it'll be a part of how we decide to structure the future funding of local roads maintenance in the next phase of the spending review.
So if you mentioned as part of that integrated settlements, which clearly indeed we're moving to potentially very big ones in the West Midlands and Greater Manchester shortly, but the general drift is that will go on to more local authorities. So in future you won't have the same relationship between your funding and what local authorities have got to spend on roads, but you're still going to be responsible for making sure that there is value for money in there. How are you going to do that?
So,
it's going to be more challenging.
So we are working this through, and I think the committee may be aware, and if not, I'm happy to ensure that information is shared, that MHCLG are working closely with us and other relevant departments about the future accountability framework, including the role of accounting officers in a context of integrated funding settlements for local government. So this is something that's a lot of thought is currently being given to, and as I say, I think it's very important that we are sharing that fully with the committee, and the committee is confident that it allows all of us in the system to discharge our accountabilities appropriately and correctly. So that's an ongoing debate. I think, as I say, what we will need to debate as well with ministers is exactly how roads funding is treated within a settlement, and how we are able to satisfy ourselves about the use of those funds on the activities intended.
So at some point you're going to have more information on that for us.
The question of the accountability framework is something that I have been discussing very recently with my counterpart in MHCLG, and we agreed actually that we should be both talking to the NAO about that, since it's quite fundamental, not just to this, there are many areas of government which will be affected by it, and the PAC.
Yeah.
Right.
And
I
was only going to...
I've got one further question, but something just about the longer term and how you measure whether road funding can actually get better value for money if there's a certainty about it over a longer term. We've had a number of PFI schemes.
Yeah.
I think 5 of them have been running on local road maintenance. One in my own city of Sheffield, been running now for, I think, about 2011 it was set up. Have you done any evaluation about not just the nature of PFI itself, but the benefits that can come from long-term funding arrangements?
So I think we, I won't talk about PFI specifically, if you don't mind. We certainly, I mean, I think our general view in transport funding and on funding of assets and funding of infrastructure is that long-term certainty is really important, because whoever the delivery partner is, whether it's a national body or a local body, knowing that there is certainty of funding allows them to sort of plan, resource and execute work as efficiently as possible. So I'm sure there are evaluations that underpin that assessment. It's an approach obviously we take on the maintenance of the railways through the control period funding.
So you're saying you're sure that there are evaluations, but are there evaluations? These schemes have been running for quite a long time now.
So I'm not aware that we've published any evaluations of the PFIs yet. Rupert may be able to correct me.
Why?
I think I'd need to come...
Well, I guess it's partly because they are still ongoing, if you like. I mean, we haven't come to the end of the...
So you don't wait till the end of something for 25 years before you assess whether it's working, do you?
I'll need to check what formal information we have on those PFIs. I just don't have that information to date, so I'm happy to
let us have
share.
A note.
So I'm happy to let you have a note on the PFI point, if that's specifically. I took your point, though, to be about long-term funding as a general proposition.
It is, rather than just the way PFI happens to be funded, but nevertheless it's probably one example exists where authorities have had some certainty over long-term over local road funding.
Do we know that has enabled them to do a better job is a very good question. Let me check and see what more information we can find for the committee.
So we have recently published an evaluation of sort of roads reform, so the strategic road side, where again you've got long-term certainty of funding, clearly covering both maintenance renewals and enhancements. And what that does show is what Bernadette said, that having that certainty has driven significant efficiencies and significant improvements in the way that the strategic roads have been managed. So you would expect that would be equally applicable to local roads, but obviously it doesn't answer your point on PFI.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We look forward to that note on that subject. So we now come to Rebecca Paul, please.
Thank you. So you've talked a little bit about responsibility for roads maintenance sitting with local authorities, but I would suggest that although that is true, our local authorities are hamstrung through, well, firstly, there's not enough money. Secondly, the short-term funding point that we've just talked about. And then when you layer on top the fact that utility companies can come in and dig the roads up whenever they like, that means often we're moving one step forwards and two steps back. So it becomes really important. We've got this pot of money that I think we would all in an ideal world like to see bigger, but the reality is we need to use that as effectively as we can. So allocation of that funding becomes really important. Now, in Surrey, we have one of the busiest road networks in the country, yet this isn't reflected in the funding it receives from the DFT. So the lion's share of funding is allocated based on road length and takes no account of traffic volume. And if you think about somewhere like Surrey, there's two major airports that people are travelling to. People are going in and out of London and down to the south coast. So why, this is to Dame Bernadette, please, why do you not consider where investment could have greatest impact in your approach to allocating funding to local authorities? Surely traffic volume is an obvious and important factor.
So look, I completely understand the argument. As you say, the current formula for allocation is, the biggest element of it is road length. That's 82%, that accounts for 82% of the allocation. And the other two items, things that we take into account, the number of bridges, which of course are very important, and the number of lighting columns. I absolutely understand the arguments that are made for including other factors, and traffic volume is the one that I guess comes up most often. I think ultimately there is a policy choice there for ministers to take, but I mean, two things I would say. When we last consulted on this, which was 2014, so some time ago, but at that point, the majority of respondents, who I expect were mostly local authorities, 63%, were against the inclusion of traffic volume. So that was the reason why that was a factor in taking, in the formula allocation being as it is. Of course, we could change it. It would be a major exercise, and there would be winners and losers, which of course we always know is challenging as well. So, for example, an obvious point would be that rural areas would likely end up with lower amounts of funding if you placed a weighting on traffic volume than urban areas. Those are choices. They are, in the end, I think, policy choices for ministers. And, but it would be a very significant shift. And I think that's why it's something we would need to think very carefully about, and I know ministers would want to reflect on very carefully.
I think it's also worth sort of recognising that within the road length element, so the 82% that's allocated to road length, that's split equally into three parts. So a third goes on A roads, a third goes on B and C, a third go on C roads. And A roads are 9.8% of roads, C roads are 62. So essentially you get £6 for every A road compared to the U roads. So that is a sort of proxy for traffic, so directs more money at the A roads, which are used more heavily. It's clearly not a perfect proxy, but it is also, I think it's important to recognise that the formula doesn't completely ignore the fact that some of our roads are used much more heavily than others.
So I'm aware of the consultation that was conducted and the 63% that you referenced. But I think one of the things that it's really important that we're doing here is taking a fact and evidence-based approach to how we allocate funds. So it's always very good to get people's views. But as you rightly said, when there are winners and losers, there is going to be bias creeping into consultation responses, and that's where I think it's really then important for the department that obviously have the interests of the entire network across the country to work out the best way that funding should be allocated. And I think, as you rightly say, it potentially probably wouldn't stop at just traffic volume, because I think you made a very good point about rural areas, and you can start thinking about climate, and I understand that it can become more complicated, but I think right now what we have isn't working. So we have got areas, and forgive me for mentioning Surrey again, but it's the area that I'm most familiar with. I think it's the 5th busiest county, and you can see it in the roads. I mean, the running joke is as you cross the border into Surrey, you see the difference, and that's not the local authorities' fault per se. It's literally the fact that many people are using those roads from outside the county. So how would you suggest we move forward in terms of getting to that more fact and evidence-based improved way of allocating funding, effectively a fairer way of allocating funding?
Obviously, as Bernadette says, there's ministerial choices in here, and one of the things that we are working with ministers on the back of the NAO report is how they want to respond. And clearly the NAO have identified the fact that we haven't looked at the formula for 10 years and a need to do that. And they've raised the importance of traffic volumes, and they've referenced condition. So those are all things that we will have conversations with ministers about, and they will ultimately decide. Clearly that will also be linked to the SR Phase 2. Because, as you say, there are fewer winners and losers if you've got more money. So I'm sure that will be part of ministers' considerations on this going forward as well.
I would just add, I think the current formula has two, key merits, one of which is sort of simplicity and objectivity, and the other of which is stability, because your road lengths don't change very much over time. Traffic volume, if you like, is a more dynamic thing. And I think on the one hand, we're trying to give local authorities long-term funding certainty, if at the same time the formula has changed in such a way that you're not quite sure how much you're going to get from one year to the next. That's a tension that we'd have to handle quite carefully.
So in light of the geographical disparity we have in road condition, do you have a view on where investment in local road maintenance would have the greatest impact? Are you starting to see trends? Have you done any work around where the need is greatest?
So we have the data that we get. Obviously, we've got the headline figure of the red routes, but beneath that we have it by local authority, which we publish. And what we see is a sort of, it's quite a mixed picture. So there aren't strong variations, aren't strong correlations in terms of it's all rural areas that have poor roads or it's all urban areas. It's quite a mixed picture. What does come out is the roads in the northeast are very good. I don't know why, but the northeast roads all come up quite high up, and some of the London and southern roads are more towards the bottom. So I think the challenge with the data is clearly it's not only measuring or informing us about our funding allocations, it's also telling us about local authorities' decisions and trying to pick out where local authorities are making certain choices with their own money in their own priorities, as opposed to it being an allocation problem, is quite difficult. So we do have that data, we do look at it. I don't think it's telling us in kind of big red letters that this is the problem and this needs to change. But as I said earlier, this is something that we're looking at off the back of the NAO report to try and get sort of more in depth into it.
Thank you. Well, I certainly welcome the fact that you're looking at this, and I would definitely suggest that traffic volume is something that should be seriously considered, because traffic volume is intrinsically linked as well with economic activity going on. So we would get substantial value, I think, from improving those networks that are highly used. According to the report, around 8% of total DFT funding, so about 1.1 billion, was allocated based on self-assessment by local authorities linked to adoption of best practice principles, so incentivisation funding. But it seems that it's recognised that this hasn't worked as well as you probably hoped it would, probably fairly for obvious reasons. And now a large part of that is allocated on normal road network information in the usual way for a majority of the funding. What are you planning to do next to incentivise improvements within local authorities? And this is to Rupert. Given that didn't really work and you've taken some, I hope, some learnings from that.
So you're right, the previous incentive element ran for a number of years. Local authorities had to sort of self-assess themselves against various sort of criteria, including whether they had a sort of asset management overall approach, whether they were following the best practice in our own code of practice document, whether they engaged enough with the public and all that sort of thing. I think we would argue not that it was a complete failure, because most authorities over time improved in their self-assessments, such that it reached the point, as you say, when the system sort of almost ran out of steam because everybody had actually got up to the top category. I don't think that means it was a failure. I think we would argue that actually that did lead to a lot of improved performance across the sector. But we do recognise that looking forward, we need to think again about incentivisation, something we'll be very much thinking about as part of the second phase of the spending review, how we can link long-term funding to a kind of new incentive element. We don't yet know precisely how a new incentive element would work. We will be looking to learn from the previous element. I think one of the criticisms of the previous incentive approach was that there was a lack of auditing by DFT. It was very much local authorities marking their own homework, if you like. So I think that's certainly one of the lessons that we will be reflecting on as we move towards developing a new incentivisation approach.
Can I just also add, and I'm not, maybe this is the right point to bring in, if what we're trying to do is incentivise local authorities to adopt best practice, to whether it's in the use of technologies, in preventative work, in engaging communities, then clearly how we structure the funding is one way we might do that, but there are other things that we can do as a department to ensure that that is happening. One of the things ministers are currently considering is a review of the code of practice for well-maintained highways, which Rupert has just mentioned. That feels to me like actually quite an important role for government to take in, as it were, convening and spreading best practice and working with local authorities to enable them to adopt it as effectively as possible. And that, as I say, is something which we are currently discussing with ministers, because I think that is another opportunity for us to play a part in supporting local authorities in this very important work.
Bernadette, given that your department used to issue national technical guidance, you have the National Transport Laboratory. My impression is, having driven around the country, that the performance of local authorities, technically, is quite variable. Mm-hmm. Isn't there a case for giving local authorities more technical guidance as to how they do maintain their roads?
That is a good question. Actually, they... so a couple of points I will make in general, which are probably sort of relevant to this, but not... One is, I do think that what the data on what local authorities allocate, the revenue funding that they are allocating to local authorities, is that has remained very stable, actually, despite the fact that they are under very significant resource constraints. We know they have continued to fund local authority revenue funding. So they are sort of, it suggests they are maintaining capability. It's an indicator rather than a kind of absolutely demonstrable thing. But the second is, yes, I do think that one of the things that we as a department can do in many areas of our work is support local authorities in executing their responsibilities on transport. And I do think there's an important enabling role for us. And you see, for example, in the way that Active Travel England is working with local authorities, how we can do that. On the question of technical guidance, though, specifically, I might ask colleagues to comment.
So obviously the code of practice is quite a significant document in and of itself, 260 odd pages. So that is our kind of key bit of guidance, and gets quite.
Do you update it?
So that is
the conversation we're currently having with ministers. It will be a major task to update it.
Yep.
But we consider there is a case for doing so.
And we can see the value. I mean, some of the things that we recognise are not in there and need to be in there from a technical perspective are particularly around climate adaptation and the kind of added focus that needs to be on that. We need to update it for the technologies that are out there in terms of not only technologies that can assess condition, but obviously technologies that are now out there in terms of pothole filling and, you know, other things. So that is very much our focus and the conversation we're having with ministers at the moment. It's also, I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that local authorities spend a lot of time and effort sharing best practice with each other via Adept, via things like Live Labs, where we're funding research into how to do the highways maintenance sustainably. So there is already quite an active community out there. What we need to do is make sure that we're playing our part and supporting that. And I think if we do review the code of practice, I think that's a key part of that.
Thank you very much. All right, Rebecca, were you
No, it's fine.
finished or not?
Yeah, I'll move on to my next point. So the Asphalt Industry Alliance's data from local authorities show that the maintenance backlog is growing. In 2019 it was 9 billion and now in 2024 it's estimated to be 15.6 billion. I know we talked about this a little bit before. So it seems like this issue is clearly getting worse and our current approach isn't working. To Dame Bernadette, why has the backlog in local road maintenance increased so substantially since 2019? And I'm particularly interested to get your views on whether you think we're putting too much emphasis on short-term sticking plaster measures, effectively, like pothole repairs, which are obviously important for road safety, but fundamentally, potholes are a symptom that a road hasn't been resurfaced when it should have been. So actually, the way that we fix this issue is by resurfacing roads at the right time. So it would just be good to get your view on that.
On the backlog point, I probably don't have a lot to add to what I said previously. You've quoted figures; they're not figures that the department formally kind of has independently verified, but we don't deny the general point that the backlog is significant, and all the evidence suggests that it's getting worse, and certainly weather conditions would lead us to that conclusion anyway. I think then the question about potholes versus other road maintenance is a really interesting one. I guess potholes has a particular political sort of salience, has under the previous government, this current government has a manifesto commitment to reduce, deal with up to 1 million potholes a year. So, you know, we know that it's become a sort of currency that the public recognises and that politicians really care about, and that's, I guess, why we will continue to urge and work with local authorities to ensure that funding is being directed towards that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, road surfacing and preventative action is ultimately what we need, what local authorities need to do, and what we need to work with them to support them in doing is ensuring that they are taking road surfaces as a general issue, and that they are taking preventative action as well as sort of action to deal with potholes as they arise. I guess I think to some extent potholes is a bit of a shorthand, isn't it? It's the sort of expression of people's frustration with the condition of roads. So, but there is a risk that we become overly focused on that at the cost of other things that local authorities need to do.
And our guidance and the incentivisation that was in there was about asset management, which is that long-term preventative approach. I think there are reasons why it's been more difficult for local authorities to do that. Obviously, the overall sort of funding position for local authorities is very tight, but I also think the fact that we've had a succession of short-term sort of funding positions means that maybe has driven local authorities to be more reactive because they can't see their programme going forward to enable them to be preventative. Again, these are arguments that we will deploy in the spending review phase 2 to try and get that sort of longer-term funding settlement.
Just one other thought on why the backlog might have increased. I mean, the one thing Bernadette didn't mention, there was inflationary pressures in recent years as well, which have, just especially in the construction sector, has meant that, your pound doesn't go quite as far as it did, plus a series of very wet winters and increasing traffic volumes. Also, just on the manifesto commitments, of course, it's to fix up to an extra million potholes a year over every year of this Parliament. So, just to clarify.
Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And I think on the pothole piece, I think it's really important because I think you're right. So when the general public talk about potholes, they are talking generally about their dissatisfaction with the roads. But actually, I think it's really important that as a department you differentiate, because I can look at those funds and I see the word pothole quite a lot. I think a lot of people that understand road maintenance would say potholes means you've left it too late. Actually, we need to have more emphasis on road resurfacing at the right time. So I think it's really incumbent actually on you as a department to drive that and counter the narrative that's out there, so that we make sure that money is being directed into the right long-term actions for our roads.
And I fully accept the point, and I think, as I say, in all of our work with local authorities, we are looking at asset management, not just narrowly at potholes. So I recognise the point, and I think it is reflected in practice in a lot of the work that we do, and actually that local authorities do too, because they know that potholes, as you say, are sort of illustrative of a problem that's been allowed to continue for too long.
So Dame Bernadette, we've had evidence from the AA, which I don't know whether you see our evidence that we get from, but just to quote on this important point to back up what Rebecca Paul is saying, it's at the bottom of their evidence it says local authorities need to break out of the cycle of reactive repairs to pre-active planned maintenance. This is the important point. The cost of reactive pothole filling, they say, was around about £74 per pothole in 22-3, compared to £50 for planned preventative maintenance. So a lot of what's being done is short-termism driven by finance. So surely we need to get more into proper planned maintenance rather than reactive to everyday troubles that arise in potholes.
I think we would strongly agree with that point.
Yeah. Yep. And it comes back to the importance of a long-term funding settlement, which is something we'll be trying very hard to pitch to our friends in the Treasury over the coming weeks and months.
We're hopefully strengthening your arm on that.
Yes.
Michael Payne.
If I may, just on this point about potholes, the NAO report shows that 31.6% of the capital allocations from DFT last year alone were specifically on the pothole fund. And I've seen with my own eyes, and I'm sure this happens around the country, this money being spent and it literally being poured down the drain. And this is valuable taxpayers' money. Potholes being repaired, not sealed incorrectly, and 2 or 3 days later they've broken apart. And obviously the local authorities, as you said earlier, Dame Bernadette, have a statutory responsibility for local roads, but the Department for Transport is accountable in terms of the use of taxpayers' money here, and this committee particularly is concerned with making sure that every pound and penny of taxpayers' money is used valuably. So I'd just like to press this point about the code of practice and the conversation that you're having. I think it's really important that there are technical standards and expectations on how that money is spent if we're going to continue with this pothole sort of focus, a third of the money being spent on potholes, because at the moment I think a significant amount of that money is being wasted. Essentially it is a sticking plaster, but it's a sticking plaster that may last 1 or 2 days at the best, and the local authority is then returning. The other point I think that taxpayers get hugely frustrated about is local authorities visiting a particular site on a road, fixing a certain pothole that meets their standards in terms of depth, and leaving 4 or 5 other potholes around it, only have to return to the same part on the road a week later. So I just think that the work that you're going to do around the code of practice and the expectations on local authorities, notwithstanding the concerns you might have around burdens, is critically important here, because this is a major source of frustration for taxpayers, seeing a huge amount of money being wasted.
Well, again, I think we take the point. I think that's a point you're making rather than a question, and we agree. I think we want to be as effective as we can be in, as you say, not just allocating funding, but ensuring that funding is spent on the activities which are going to have the best outcomes.
I've just got one final point, because I think it's really important. I understand this is a challenge, and I think it's important to put ideas out there really and try and be constructive here. So as a county councillor, one of the frustrations I have is that we obviously have community infrastructure levy, And that the purpose of that is absolutely to invest into infrastructure related to development, and that can include resurfacing, repairing roads. I'm interested whether you have done any work on understanding the unspent funds across the country, because I suspect it's billions, and whether you have given any thought to how that money can help address the challenges we face with our roads.
I'm not sure I understand what the unspent money
the community
is.
Infrastructure levy. So it's money that's sat with the
CIL.
local authority, so
Right.
it's not sat with the DFT.
I'm not aware that we've looked at that.
Look, it's a very interesting point. I'll have to take it away and look. I suspect that's a conversation again we need to have with MHCLG, who kind of administers.
That would be fantastic, and that's all
it's
I'm
just
asking.
genuinely, very
I think,
happy. I'll take it away.
I think as a councillor, anyone who's a councillor will be aware of it, but actually I find that quite often people in government aren't necessarily
If there's
aware
unspent
of it.
money somewhere, then we'll be very interested in identifying
an
it.
exercise to look at whether that can be part of the solution, I think would be really valuable.
Let us take that away.
Okay. Happy?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Rachel. Oh, she's gone. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Chair. You've just agreed with Michael Payne that clearly money has to be well spent, patching up a pothole for it only to break apart a week or two later, or patching up one pothole and leaving others around about in a dreadful state is clearly what our constituents see all too regularly, and you've agreed is not satisfactory. But my understanding is from the NAO, you've not evaluated whether the funding, the billions you've funded for local road maintenance since 2015, you've not evaluated the impact that it has on road conditions. So how are you going to know which of the mechanisms that you've used to allocate funding has been most effective?
We've recently published an evaluation of the Potholes Fund, which obviously has been quite a significant element of the funding in recent years, and so we have some points that have emerged from that. We know that local authorities, for example, interpret the fund broadly and don't necessarily treat all our separate funding streams as ring-fenced, which is probably quite sensible of them, that they want to see a long-term funding strategy, which is something we've talked about. And they've also highlighted their interest in us doing more consistent data collection. So we have done that evaluation, and I think that's an important one, and it definitely is pointing to some lessons which should be very important to us going forward. More generally, I mean, I sort of reflected on this in the light of the NAO report. You know, we are a department that actually does do an awful lot of evaluation. Like, we take it very seriously, and we embed it in our work. And I sort of asked the question, should we do more in relation to local road condition funding? I mean, the reason we don't evaluate everything is back to this point about this is money we allocate to local authorities, and then we sort of rely upon them in executing their statutory duties to do so sensibly. It's also because actually we know fundamentally this is very good value for money. So, you know, I'm not going to lie awake at night as an accounting officer worrying about that. But look, it's an important point. We should do more to evaluate, whether that's formal evaluation in an analytical sense or more general best practice. And I think the Code of Practice work gives us an opportunity to do that.
Thank you. And obviously evaluating funding measures different techniques and styles, but also we all agreed earlier in this session that longer term funding streams are generally better value for money. So will is there a case for finding ways of establishing long-term funding? Because in a lot of infrastructure, and obviously I know about transport, there's a strong case for more long-term funding streams, but they aren't always there. So is there more possibilities for this?
It's something we actively want to explore, and we do have long-term funding for our railways maintenance and for the maintenance of our strategic road network, and we do that because we know it's more efficient. So we should be asking ourselves, why don't we do that for local road and local authorities as well? In the end, that is a conversation that we will need to have with Treasury, and it's a set of choices for ministers, because whilst long-term funding has the attractions and the benefits you say, ministers will also want to retain a degree of funding flexibility over periods of time in order to be able to adjust fundings as well. So it's definitely a live issue and something which we will be discussing.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Rebecca, please.
15.
Well, if give you time to breathe. Let me come back to this important business of funding, Dame. You've announced in this £500 million worth of funding, but in the longer term there is 8.3 billion to be funded from the HS2 pot. Can you just sort of give us an idea where we are with the total funding for roads?
No. Sorry, I'm sorry if that's an unhelpful answer, but I genuinely am able to do that because what the government has set out is its spending plans for this year and next. And we will be allocating funding for next year for local roads imminently. So we'll be able to confirm funding for 25-26 very soon.
When will that be?
Imminently.
Right.
So it is, obviously ministers will have to approve that and be satisfied. But I hope that gives a sense that it's going to be soon. Beyond that, I can't give any assurances to the committee because this is something we'll have to look at in the spending review phase 2. All I can say is that from a DFT perspective, we will be making the case for the importance of funding for local roads maintenance.
So can you
I don't think I can be more helpful than that.
But just why you referred to the £8.3 billion from the HS2 programme. I mean, that was a figure that the previous government had announced, and I think the current government has said it's looking again at the affordability of the various commitments that were made under the Network North plan. So I think that £8.3 billion figure is one which no longer has any particular traction, if you like. But it's all now being reviewed as part of the spending review.
Okay. Can you at least give us a clue when you do make this announcement, given that the whole thrust of our hearing today has been short-termism over long-term planning, when you do make an announcement, will there be any certainty of a number of years of what sort of funding they're likely to get? This
will be down to the spending review and decisions that Treasury will need to take and the government will need to take about the period of the spending review and what it's going to cover. I mean, my best expectation at the moment is that we'll be looking at the 3 years beyond 25-26 in the SR phase 2, although I know Treasury are interested, particularly for capital, in looking slightly longer term to this point about short term and long term and the importance of certainty for efficient infrastructure investment. So it's not in my hands, so I can't give you the assurances. It will depend on how the spending review is. The process is determined by the Treasury.
Well, I'm sure that's something the committee will wish to return to.
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
Could I just sort of clarify something you said earlier, because it sort of raised alarm bells in my head. This £4.4 billion figure that you said was spent on roads each year. Can you give us a bit of a breakdown on that? Because I don't recognise that figure. I
was actually reflecting on this, preparing for the committee, that I thought we might need to write to you on it, actually, because I don't think it is as clear in the NAO report. Sorry, I'm not disagreeing in any way with the NAO report, but I think it's something which it may be helpful to clarify for the committee. So if I take 2023, DFT provided capital funding, which, including the funding allocated to MCAs through Crust for local roads, came to about 1.2 billion. 1.2 billion. I'm rounding quite loose. I'm rounding here, and we can give you the detail break. And then, in addition, there was additional capital funding from locally derived sources, which local authorities provided of capital of around 1.5 billion. And there was revenue funding, which local authorities again allocated from local sources, and I assume from MHCLG's revenue support grant of about 1.8 billion. So we have a quite detailed table here. It actually draws on MHCLG capital receipt data, which is published. So that's the source of those numbers. And if it would be helpful to clarify those, we'd be very happy to provide more written information to the committee.
I accept it is a very
because it is complicated.
It's a complex
that's
landscape.
helpful. I mean, those three figures combined, admittedly, some of that's capital and some of it's
Yes,
revenue.
it's capital and revenue combined.
So we need to just really separate that out. It becomes to 4.5 billion.
Yes, so that's...
I don't know whether... Yes. Can I just bring Johnny Meridiano in on this?
Yeah, just to come in briefly, I don't think we disagree with the figures.
No,
I think it's just it's not the focus of the report.
It's not the focus. The focus of the report was DFT funding. Yeah.
Yeah, and a large amount of the funding there referring to revenue funding. So that's for things like cutting grass verges, gritting roads, other things that aren't necessarily the focus of
local
the
roads
maintenance
import.
activity. It also includes some of the staff capability costs, which is relevant, but actually outside of the scope of the area we're looking at here.
Okay, that's really helpful. Peter Fortune.
Thank you. Actually, I have to admit that surprised me a little bit with that 8.3 million allocation. So just from, billion rather. So just for my clarity, that because there was 150 billion issued in 23-24, 150 again in 24-25, right? And I think local authorities were expecting that to continue. So I think that's
current. That's passed in this year. So
this year passed, and obviously there's the 500 million extra this year, the next year,
which the current government has committed to. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
In the budget.
And actually, in the figures, and sorry if you touched on this earlier, in the figures that were talked about in the paper of the 1.1 billion to 1.6 billion, that didn't include that money that had come from the cancelled HS2 funds, did it?
There's a little bit of sort of obviously Network North money, HS2 money, had a kind of currency under the last government, which meant that it was separately identified. If you look at what has happened with the allocation for next year, effectively what we have got is the allocation that we had last year plus the 150 plus 500.
Yeah.
So the sort of it's all kind of additive. So if you wanted to, you could say, well, there's 650 from Network North, but it's slightly sort of.
When we look at the figure that says there's a 50% increase, that's not including the Network North money that's gone in.
So the current year. Sorry, let me just check.
Yeah.
In the current year, taking the block funding, potholes fund, and the funding that was allocated by the previous government as a consequence of Network North, we have a total allocation of 1.275.
Yeah.
And for next year, the allocation will be that 1.275 plus 500, the 500 announced by the Chancellor in the budget, bringing us to 1.775 billion.
Okay. And we're going to get a decision on if that cancelled HS2 money is going to be used or continue to be used and allocated to local authorities soon.
So this government is reviewing future spend, and that will include any Network North commitments. But those were commitments, obviously, under the previous government. That was a previous government publication. This government is now looking broadly at spending in the spending review and will decide there what the appropriate levels are.
Right, okay. And previously, what was happening with that allocation in London, because I'm a London MP, is that money was going direct to the local authorities as opposed to TfL, or about 96% of it was, I think.
Yeah, some of it went to TfL, some of it went to the individual boroughs, you're right.
Right, and is the thinking currently that were it to continue, it would still go direct to the local authorities, which is where I think it is better used rather than going to TfL?
We don't yet have a decision from ministers on exactly how the allocation in 25-26 will work.
But that decision is imminent, so we'll be able to share the details at that point on how that point's being addressed.
Okay. All right. How imminent would you say?
I hope. I'm sure the chair is familiar with. Imminent, I would. Ministers.
Christmas or spring?
I think we're Christmas rather than spring.
Yeah.
Look, we would want local authorities to have certainty for next year as soon as possible.
Yeah,
and that is true. And then there's always the usual choices in government about grid slots and things of that sort. So
it makes a really important point because poor old local authorities got a plan. The next financial year is coming up pretty rapidly, so they do need this information as soon as possible.
So if that's going to hit my local authority by probably about £500,000, I would have thought.
Yeah,
in terms of what they can do, which is
materials.
It's a huge
Understood.
figure. When I'm driving outside of my local authority, which is, of course, perfectly smooth and wonderful roads, and I hit a pothole, I always say to myself, and my kids take the mick out of me for, I go, what am I paying my flipping road tax for? And I went away to think about that when I saw the Asphalt Industry Alliance figure of the backlog of 15.6 billion. So I had a squidge at the fuel duty figures and the vehicle excise duty figures. So there's 24.3 billion taken in on fuel duty and 8.2 billion taken in on vehicle excise duty, which is about 32.5 billion, about twice what's required to fix all the existing potholes. So I guess if I was answering my own question, which is what am I paying the road tax for, what would be the answer? Where's the rest of that allocation going if we can't find half of it to bring all the roads up to speed?
Well, I think, as you know, taxes generally aren't hypothecated to specific purposes. So you'd probably need to raise that question with the Treasury. All I will say is in DFT we would always welcome seeing more money being spent on roads maintenance.
So that's what I thought. What am I paying my road tax for?
You got the answer you expected.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Peter, I think you weren't here at the beginning. You may have interests you wish to declare at this point.
In
local government?
No.
No, local government. Okay.
I have an interest in local government, but I'm not a councillor.
Oh, no, sorry about that. Okay, thank you. Rebecca Paul, please.
So in my local area, I'm seeing increased incidences of flooding on the highway, which obviously undermines road integrity, water ingress, obviously is part of the reason we end up with potholes. So to Dame Bernadette, what are you doing to help local authorities adapt and make their roads more resilient to the impacts of climate change? And have you given any, taken into account any changes needed to road surfaces as a result of the increased volumes of electric vehicles that we're going to start seeing, given their heavier weight, which obviously is going to have a different impact, more stress on the road surface?
On climate change and adaptation, that is exactly the sort of issue that we want to look at in looking at the code of practice, because clearly that's a growing and important issue for road surfaces and road conditions. So that's where we would expect to pick that up. And I think there's also a subcommittee of the UK Roads Leadership Group as well, which has been formed to help ensure that local authorities and others are able to sort of share experience and best practice. So it's a known issue, and it's one that we would expect to be addressed through those routes.
Yes, so as Bernadette says, UK ROG, we've got the Adaptation, Biodiversity and Climate Board, which has been a new innovation, drawing on local authorities and their expertise. What we've got particular expertise from the impacts of Storm Desmond in the north and the kind of flooding that came from that. We've done quite a bit of work with PARC, the World Road Association, where they've got technical committees looking at these disaster recovery. So we've been funding a project on what's called rapid impact assessments, which is how you help local authorities to triage an effect when they have had a big flood. How do you actually respond to it in the most effective way? So there's a lot of activity going on, but as Bernadette says, what we need to do is translate that into the code of practice to enable it to be disseminated more broadly and more widely. I think we also need to clearly, coming back to the funding allocation, think about the extent to which adaptation and climate feeds into any review of that. On EVs specifically, clearly EVs are heavier than normal cars. The main roads are clearly built to withstand 44-tonne HGVs. So the impact of more EVs on those roads is actually a kind of quite slight. The Euro network is built to a wide range of differing standards. Obviously, some of them are medieval, some of them are more modern. So that is the area where EVs are potentially more of a challenge. But even there, the weight of an EV is still going to be below the weight of a 26-tonne lorry. So I don't think the impact is going to be that great. The risk factor that we're actively considering are things like electric buses, electric HGVs. We're thinking about how the network absorbs those and reacts to those is probably more pertinent than the EVs themselves. I think it's also worth noting that at the moment EVs are only something like 3 or 4% of the car park, so the impact of those vehicles is quite minimal. But also we need to recognise that cars as a whole are getting bigger and heavier, so it's not actually just an EV issue, it's a more the way that our roads are being used.
I think.
I think we would accept this as a hugely important area. The department. It's also just one thing to add is that the department published earlier this year a draft transport adaptation strategy, part of which was about giving additional responsibilities to organisations like local highway authorities, and all of that. And it's all about embedding adaptation and resilience considerations into everyday activities. So the department's currently considering responses to that consultation, and we'll make a further announcement shortly.
I think it's really important that we sort of keep the holistic picture in mind, given there are sort of quite ambitious targets around this. We do need to make sure that we're building all of that into the plans that we have for our roads. And although it sounds that you're not overly concerned, I would imagine if a big chunk of normal cars, if people change over to electric vehicles and they're going over our road surfaces, day after day, that's going to have an impact, and particularly on roads that already aren't up to standard and that already, that structural integrity is already being impacted. In terms of the climate piece, because obviously the flooding, the increased flooding that we're seeing on highways, I'm sure lots of people across the country are impacted by this. It sounds like you've started to look at some of this, but have you got a view? Have you sort of assessed the particular areas in the country that are most at risk of this? Is that going to feed into the work that you're doing?
So I think DEFRA do flood risk mapping, which is out there, and obviously the road network, you can map it across that. So I know that National Highways is doing quite a lot of work. I think clearly, coming back to the point about responsibilities, it's for the local authority to determine how it manages its flood risk in its area. But I think you raise a good point about making sure that we are cognizant of the differential impacts that might have across the country, and seeing whether that needs to be reflected in the way that we allocate money. So that's a point I will take away and consider how we make sure that we don't miss that issue going forward.
Yeah, I would say flood risk on our roads is really, really important, and it actually feeds into the point I was making again on community infrastructure levy, because that can be used for drainage improvements, and when you're doing road maintenance, that is the ideal time to make sure your drainage is sorted out. So we really need to bring all of this thinking together. In order that we've got sound roads that drain properly, because obviously that water on them just means they've got a shorter lifespan. So we really need to bring all of that together. So I wanted now just to touch on autonomous vehicles that are going to drive themselves. This is quite a new thing for me. I've not seen one of these in action. Now. We're expecting to see them in England as early as 2026, which obviously is going to mean that our roads are going to need to be ready for that. So what work have you started doing to assess the state our roads are going to need to be in order to support that? And can you set out for us the challenges, the opportunities, where you think you're at with that?
I think on one level, to be sort of authorised as an autonomous technology, the technology needs to be capable to operate on all of our roads safely. So there's a making the vehicles fit for the roads as much as making the roads fit for the vehicles. So clearly we cannot approve a technology that's not safe and capable of being used across our road network.
We can't be approving, we can't be saying that it needs to meet the needs of unsafe roads. That surely can't be what we're suggesting.
No, but nor can it be...
Our roads need to be up to standard.
Yeah, but nor can it be that we have to raise every single road in the country up to a gold standard that an autonomous vehicle needs. That also is not right. Okay. So it's about making sure that the technology and the roads work properly together in all circumstances. There are already licensed sort of semi-autonomous systems out there. So Ford Blue Cruise is the first one to have been sort of authorised for use on strategic roads. The issue with that technology is around lineage, effectively. So the lines on the road need to be of a sufficient standard that they can spot them. That's a challenge from a road maintenance perspective because that's a revenue cost, not a capital cost. So here that's about our relationship with MHLG and the broader local authority settlement. That needs to be right to enable those technologies to be used on the local network. At the moment, it's on the strategic, where we do have that control, and we are thinking actively about it. I think we recognise that this is a future challenge, and things are moving really quickly, but also changing very quickly. So, trying to understand exactly what the roads need, how the roads need to operate to enable the technology, is constantly changing. But we have within the department a unit called the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, who are working with Department of Business and Trade to formulate this market and to think about what we need in terms of infrastructure and other things.
Thank you. It does feel that we have, it's quite a challenge, is it, when already we're in a situation where our roads aren't up to standard, and we already in a position where we've got potholes that are dangerous.
Finished?
I'm finished. Thank you.
I want to just follow up, Mr. Buttery, if I can, three important points in relation to Ms. Paul's excellent questions. Firstly, on gross vehicle weights. You were, in answer to her, talking about the extra weights of commercial vehicles, which are currently the maximum on our roads is 44 tonnes. Does that mean you're contemplating having heavier vehicles on our roads to compensate for the extra weight of electric vehicles? Because if you don't, that means the payload of HGVs will be lower. But if you do increase the weights, that's going to give considerable problems to our roads and particularly our bridges. So what is the thinking on this?
So obviously it will be ministers to decide ultimately, but clearly the sector is campaigning to allow heavier vehicles to get around the payload sort of disadvantage of electric vehicles. I look after infrastructure rather than vehicles, so my worry is the worry that you've expressed about bridges and actually the capability of the network to take those heavier weights or the cost that would be required to implement them. So that no decisions have been made. I kind of mention them as a risk factor, in effect, thinking about what are the, as Ms. Paul was saying, what are the things that are coming that could be an impact on the network. That is an area where there is a risk we could have to cope with heavier vehicles. But I'm sorry if you took that to mean that was a direction of travel.
You've opened that particular box up. I'm sure others will have a lot to say on that. The second one was autonomous vehicles that Ms. Paul was asking about. I mean, there are two aspects to this. There's the conditions of the road and the white lines, as you pointed out. Were you hinting in your answer to her that you think that if we're going to have any large-scale rollout of autonomous vehicles, that they would only be allowed on certain vehicles, say A and B roads, which could be guaranteed to be maintained to a certain standard and have proper white lines? I mean, the idea of doing C and unclassified roads to those standards would involve huge costs, surely.
It would. So that was why, I suppose the point I made at the beginning is that autonomous vehicles need to work on all roads safely, or I presume in theory, could only be limited to certain roads as long as the technology allows you. Again, this isn't my policy area, but sort of safety is the overriding sort of focus of the government in this area. And so unless the technology is safe to operate in all of the environments, I think we would take a precautionary approach and not enable that technology.
And given that I've opened quite a Pandora's box with those two questions, I think perhaps Dame Bernadette, we might have a little bit of correspondence on this.
Yes, I think that's fair. I mean, as Dave says, this is sort of slightly beyond the remit of this particular hearing. It's going into the wider approach to these. So I'd be very happy to write to the committee and update them on this.
Yeah, and the Transport Committee in the last Parliament did an inquiry on autonomous vehicles.
Yes, so I think a note that we could get into the public domain, and then maybe the Transport Select Committee or ourselves can follow that up.
Yeah,
and the third point arising from Ms. Ball's excellent questions was gullies. Water on roads, standing water on roads, it almost does as much damage to them, particularly when it's standing water followed by frost. The potholes come straight out. So we haven't talked about cleaning gullies at all today, but will you, in your evaluation of how much money local authorities need, take that into account?
Yeah, so agree with you completely. Clearing gullies is really important. Again, that's a revenue cost. So again, we get back into the sort of the revenue side of local authorities. But the point you make is exactly right. If you have good drainage, as Ms. Ball said, you avoid the standing water, you avoid the damage in the first place. You don't need to incur the capital cost. So all of those things will be in our guidance. Clearly, we have less control over that side of the funding. So that's about the conversations we have with MHCLG.
So finally, Ms. Dame Bernadette, I think we will obviously want to examine, when there is a proper settlement out, what it is and what it's going to pay for. But in order to do that, I think it would be really helpful if we could have had a note. I mean, you've given us the figures, this $4.5 billion, but I'm not still quite clear which is capital and which is revenue.
So we can set that
particularly in the local government bit of it. If you could set that out, would be really, really helpful.
Yep.
So unless members have got any other questions. Yes, of course.
Sorry. Yes, I just want to pick up one that I wanted to ask on around a subset of the guidance on asset management that you may be providing. So how's your approach to local road maintenance supporting your department's other priorities? And I'm particularly thinking of walking and cycling.
So, I mean, one of the things we are... I'm personally very interested in is the Welsh approach, where they've in turn put a hierarchy where footways are at the top of the hierarchy in terms of maintenance. Okay. And I think that's something, obviously Wales is part of the UK RLG. That's the route through which we'd update the code of practice. So that's an area where I'm particularly interested in understanding whether that's worked and the degree to which we should replicate that in England.
Fundamentally, as we said before, if we can sort out long-term sustained maintenance funding, that helps the government then deliver its active travel objectives, because you can't walk on a pavement that's not properly maintained and so on. So the two are linked.
This committee's had hearings into active travel, and I'm absolutely certain we will want to come back to that subject, and this will be a factor in it. So, Michael Payne.
Thank you, Chair. Just building on Ruth's point about pedestrians and cyclists, I just wonder what consideration the department's giving to the balance between safety for pedestrians and cyclists versus the drive for energy efficiency. There's clearly been a move towards LED street lighting. It forms part of your allocation for the conditions of roads, and clearly safe roads are not just about the condition of roads but the lighting on the roads, particularly for pedestrians and cyclists. And one of the issues I get written to a lot about is the drive towards energy efficiency with street lighting has negated the impact of that lighting and actually people feeling unsafe. So I just wondered what consideration is being given to that. It's clearly a key mission for the incoming government, making Britain's streets safer. Can that be considered as part of your considerations going forward around the update to the guidance, etc.?
Yes, and I mean, the other thing I would say is I think the Secretary of State confirmed at the Transport Select Committee last week that road safety in general is a top priority for her, and that she wishes to take forward a road safety strategy. I think there will be many issues that we'll want to consider in that, but it's absolutely a high priority, and as I say, all aspects of road safety will be looked at in that work.
Thank you.
Dame Bernadette, can I thank you and your fellow witnesses very much. We're a new committee. We're still sort of getting used to things, as I'm sure you are, but thank you very much for bearing with us. And an uncorrected transcript of this hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days, and the committee consider the evidence provided and will produce a report and recommendations in due course, which you will no doubt look forward to studying.
Indeed.
So thank you all very much. Thank members very much. Order.